Actually, that's an interesting question to talk about the impact of Expos economically, because many people consider them to be something like the Olympics. In other words, a hemorrhage of money that does nobody any good except in the very, very short run. And here's the answer. It actually is an investment in the long-term viability of a city and a country. For example, when you look at the first World's Fair, 1851, the great exhibition of the works of industry in London, they made a profit such that it varies about maybe $17 million by one account that I've read, even more than that by other accounts. That funded everything from the Victoria and Albert Museum to actually Nobel laureates to this very day through a series of scholarships that were set up by those profits 170 years ago. More recently, you had the 1889 Expo in Paris, in which it was used as an excuse in many ways to revamp the city, as Paris had done in 1867 and 1878 as well, made a profit of around $80 million, and again reinvigorated the city, as they also did in 1893 at the Chicago Columbian Exposition. So, these can be hugely profitable in the very best way for the host cities. More recently, Shanghai spent somewhere between $50 to $90 billion on elevating their infrastructure for Expo 2010. Likewise, the UAE has actually put in about $9 billion, probably will realize $33 billion at least in return. This is because they use this opportunity, this excuse, if you will, of the World Expo to build up their infrastructure for commerce and to improve the lives of their inhabitants. Some have a different opinion. They'll often point to the last World's Fair that took place in the United States in 1984 in New Orleans. That went bankrupt even before it ended. That was considered proof positive that you cannot afford a World's Fair, that it's a waste of money. And here's an interesting fact. The area of New Orleans, near the river, the central business district and such, that had been worked on, improved, elevated for that fair, in the years since, it's produced $81.7 billion in economic benefits. A World's Fair can actually bring an enormous amount of money into a country, into a city, but over the long run. It has to be looked at the same way you look at your 401k, as something that you put in over time and then you later reap the benefits of. I love it when people ask about should we even bother showing inventions anymore at expos, because after all we can see everything on YouTube, we can see everything, on TikTok. Why even bother? And there's a reason for this, a reason why this is more important than ever and has been for almost 2 centuries. Expos form critical mass. That is, enough people gather and then take away the idea so that it reaches a tipping point. We've done this for everything from the alternating current system of electricity in America to baby incubators to actually fingerprinting at the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. When enough people get together face to face, not through screens, they can interact, they can kind of talk with each other, network, and then there's a kind of an exodus of them after the expo where they spread the idea. This is why expos have been used to debut everything from an early fax machine to television to the Ford Mustang automobile. Today, we're still seeing this, except that this expo, it'll be more about technology for survival. For instance, in the Czech pavilion, you actually have the ability to draw water out of air. There's a vertical farm that looks like a cone over in the Netherlands pavilion. Spain has some interesting cones as well, which don't use power to draw hot air out of the pavilion and then lift it out so that it naturally cools the environment. What will come out of this is a similar understanding and I hope critical mass of belief in that all these technologies cumulatively can actually improve the world very, very quickly. Because right now we're in crisis mode. We absolutely have to react quickly to a world burning faster than we even feared. I think it's going to impact the region in a way that it impacted Shanghai, in the way that it impacted Paris once upon a time, London, Philadelphia in the United States. It gives credence and credibility and authority, if you will, to the host city. That, I think, is the biggest impact of it. This is part of an access over time that has gone from London, Paris to the United States, back to Paris, back to New York, back to Chicago, multiple times, keeping it for themselves, so to speak, in that region of the world. This now has moved to other parts of the world for Expo. And that's the biggest impact because it subtly and kind of subliminally means that they are on an equal footing with the other countries that have held Expo. It also means that other countries who are not in the mix of the usual Expo host can expect to actually bid for and win the right to host an Expo much more than ever before. That is, they have an opportunity to host it when maybe 20, 30 years ago, they might not have had much of a chance. The biggest challenge that we face right now is simply because of COVID. I work in the exhibition industry. I work in an industry that actually lost 80% of its economic value in less than 1 year, from about $105 billion down to about 20. It was devastating. And we're talking shows that draw 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 people, not 100,000 people a day as they've been doing here recently. Yet, we've been able to do it safely. This shows it can be done for mega events, from the Olympics to the World Cup to anything else you've got. It shows it can be done without people being harmed. It shows that enough focus, determination, structure, and with people being mindful of their responsibilities to their other citizens, that we can pull this off. It may be a kind of inadvertent and unexpected effect of Expo because nobody saw COVID coming, but it's probably one of the best effects it can have, showing us we don't have to be isolated necessarily anymore. I love the idea of a conflict between the melting pot, but maybe something opposite it, where we all have our individual place. I think maybe it's a little of both. And the reason I say that is when I see the Majlis, when I see the program for people on the planet, when I see all these efforts to find, identify innovators around the globe from Expo 2020 and to fund them and enable them, you're doing both. You're trying to find common ground in your ideas. You're trying to find ways to exercise soft power. That is where you win adherence to your ideas by attraction, not coercion. By the same token, you're also showing other parts of the world that you deserve an equal footing for your ideas and your political entity, which is another reason why Expo moving from city to city to city, Paris, New York, Shanghai, Dubai, is important. It implies the equality of those groups, of those factions, of those people. Expo, I think, does a little bit of both. I can see people talking, and there have been some interesting conflicts in terms of opinion here, during Space Week especially. On the other hand, I see them holding their ground. I see them talking it out. I see them trying to reach a consensus on, as I think Lenin put it, who and whom, who does what to whom. If we can even begin to approach those problems here, dealing with resources and climate change, we've accomplished a lot. I think that's really interesting, and I'll tell you why. It may not be the answer you're going to expect as for what Expo 2020 has brought to the world. Metrics. No expo has ever really tried to measure its effectiveness, because really most people think of them as one and done. You know, they're around for a while, and then like Brigadoon, they just magically vanish and go away. This expo is putting an emphasis on following afterwards what effect they've had on the social and political climate. They want to measure it. In this way, it's interesting because they're following the trend of recent years in the exhibition industry in general. They've picked it up, but Expo 2020 is the first to do this, and that is hugely significant because I can tell you that the others planning expos in ensuing years are looking at this very, very closely and want to emulate that very best practice, which I think is actually kind of a touch of genius. And there's another effect too, and I kind of call it the Majlis effect. I love the idea of reverting to storytelling, talking and storytelling to convey messages, to reach consensus, to discuss differences. And the reason I say that is because many expos tend to be too reliant on screens, not enough on the interaction of people face to face, which during COVID, we found out just how much we really do value. I think that will be the next big net effect, ripple effect of Expo 2020, the idea of storytelling, of making these contacts and then creating a tipping point for these ideas. I think it's that innovation, change are happening here. And in many ways, it was a story in Shanghai too. But for someone from the United States, we tend to have a sometimes parochial belief that we're number one in everything. What we learn when we go to Expo is how good some of these other countries are at doing what we pride ourselves in doing. Innovation, experimentation, agility, quickness. Expo 2020 to me shows that other countries can adapt to the world, change the world, and bring progress to everyone through those same virtues. We don't have a monopoly on them anymore. I think in talking about why we should or should not fund expos, our pavilions at expos rather, publicly, it goes back to something else. It goes back to the belief, again mentioning New Orleans, that it's a waste of money. It's a hemorrhage of money. So why would you do this? The other part of that belief is that expos are something your grandmother did. But the fact is, these are exciting places with some vibrant new technologies and ideas. And that if you really want to have influence in the world, you really shouldn't rely on armies, but rather the attraction that Expo can bring you. This is an opportunity to sell yourself in the best way possible. Since, in fact, about the year 2000, roughly 73% of people, of countries that is, appearing at Expo are doing it for nation branding. In other words, those who are taking part are several steps of those who do not take part and are able to ensconce themselves in the world consciousness as something in the way they want to be seen. And that's extremely important for the U.S. to do. After all, given how much we're involved in world affairs, why would we not want to burnish it as much as possible? Expos allow us to do exactly that for a relatively small amount of money. Look, I come here and you will be touched to see how people respond to a flag standing in the corner. There was a wonderful moment I observed yesterday when person after person stepped out of line to stand in front of the American flag and not take a selfie, but rather they had a companion photograph them while they were standing very formally in front of the flag. And these are people who I believe were not Americans rather, but people from all over. flag, the country, still means a lot to others. It has an image which hasn't been tarnished yet. To publicly finance Expo gives us a chance to put flags, so to speak, on a bigger level, in a bigger and better way, at Expo in the future. And I really hope we do it. I think I just want to tell you this. Expo is where the future goes to be seen. It is where you're going to see tomorrow. It is where you have a chance to see what the world is doing and wants to do without intermediaries. That is, you can just go to here, the Majlis, and discover for yourself what's going on in themes as varied as space and inclusivity. You can go to the Women's Pavilion here, which I find astonishing because given our stereotyped ideas about the Middle East, you have a Women's Pavilion, the first one officially at a World Expo since 1893 in Chicago. That's astounding to see. You can also see the wonders of biomorphic architecture, that is, architecture that imitates nature. So Australia looks like a cumulus cloud. The United Kingdom looks like a conch shell. And those are just a few. Sweden's is basically a forest. And what's kind of neat is this all goes back to the very first Expo 170 years ago when Joseph Paxton, who basically built greenhouses, designed the Crystal Palace based on an Amazonian water lily named in honor of Queen Victoria. But based on that idea, he could build a structure 1,851 feet wide, 408 feet long, 9 stories tall, that wowed the world. All because he looked at a water lily. It was the first great experiment in biomorphic design, and it set the world on fire. Everything we see in that kind of architecture comes from that expo. And expos ever since then have copied that. So you come for the ideas, yeah, but you can also come to be awed. And if that's not a reason to go somewhere, I really don't know what is.